Good evening, and welcome once again to Into Infinity Talk. I am your host, Kevin Koerber, and on episode 5 in our continuing series of the solar system, going to be talking once again to William Keifer, and tonight's subject is Planet X or Planet 9. How you doing, William?
Good evening, Kevin. How y'all doing, everybody? Hey, before we start, I want to make a quick addendum to episode 4. When I was talking about the asteroid that killed off the dinosaurs, I mistakenly said Mach 7. It would have been more around Mach 12 to Mach 14. It went incredibly a lot faster. Asteroids move ridiculously fast. Let's just leave it at that.
That's fast.
Now, for Planet 9 and Planet 10 as well, but we won't talk much about that one. There's even less evidence for Planet 10. The Planet X, in and of itself, is very interesting. There should be a little graph on the screen. This is the actual hard evidence for Planet 9. And some of you may be confused about it, but this is the orbital track data of the Kuiper Belt objects. You have Setna and a few others, 2014, the year that the objects, etc., were found. And if you can notice on this screen, a lot of them converge in a single spot and then have extremely wild elliptical orbits. Some of them may have even been thrown out. This would suggest an object anywhere from a super Earth-sized object, so something about 1 to 2 times the size of Earth, a good heavy rocky planet, or something that is roughly in between Uranus and Neptune in size, maybe slightly bigger, would come in on an orbit, interact with all of these objects roughly around the same time, and then head out itself. If there is one, it is most likely on an extreme orbit in and of itself, probably an elliptical orbit that would most likely orbit somewhere around every couple hundred years. It's pretty far out there.
Yeah, the whole graphic there, those are really, really erratic orbits, right?
Oh yeah, some of them are probably even being thrown out as it will continue to do that. It's the same thing that Jupiter does with stuff from the asteroid belt, except for this is on a lot more of an extreme case when it comes to it.
Right.
We're talking, it has to be somewhere around the size that I mentioned before, most likely a super Earth at the range that it is moving. Now, I have a tiny theory of my own, and I like to go and share that it possibly, with its elliptical orbit the way that it would be, if it does have one, of course we don't know until we actually find it, if it's out there, or it could be something else that could be going on that we just don't know. This is a fun thing. Sometimes you just don't know, and you have to be able to admit when you don't know.
I do all the time.
Planet 9 was probably not formed within the solar system. It was probably captured by an approaching star. Our sun might have been bigger than it, or this was on the extreme orbit and it captured it, or it was just a rogue planet, a planet that got thrown out by its star and then managed to come in close enough where the sun managed to capture it, and it's on such an extreme elliptical orbit. A lot of exoplanets that we find that are on extreme elliptical orbits would suggest that it either interacted with another one of its basically one of the large interplanetary bodies, or it was a captured object, especially if they're on the far outer area. Always keep in mind, and something that I've said in the first episode, our solar system is extremely unusual because it's very calm. It's very flat in orientation. It's very much more a disk than the other ones are, where the planets are kind of up, down, up, down, up, down, any direction that they want. Though, luckily, it seems like they all orbit in the same direction. There's only been a few that we've found so far where they're orbiting in opposite directions, and that tends to lead to planetary collisions. It usually is young stars when there's large objects going in the opposite direction, or it's a captured object. That's always nice. Now, going a little bit more into possibility for Planet 9 is, if it was from another star, it would be a good chance, after we actually found it, to send a mission, send a probe, etc. to it. It would give us an opportunity without really having to leave the solar system to study planet composition of other stars without having to actually leave. And if we find resources that are very abundant on Earth, like if they find, say, water, materials for building life, anything like that, then we know that all that sort of stuff would be fairly common, especially if we can confirm that it was not formed in the solar system. So think if they go there and they find like a radio tower, and then that would tell us that, oh, hey, this planet before it got flung out had intelligent species on it. Or, if it had the monolith from 2001, oh my.
Yeah, I always gravitate back to the 2001 comparison because 2001, it's one of my favorite. I actually for a while called it a documentary, but that film is, and again, it still stands the test of time. So if out on that rogue planet, you would have not necessarily a monolith, but like you said, a radio tower, signs of intelligence, possibly. Actually, it could have been like an outpost used by some other civilization. And it was one way or another thrown out of its system and captured by ours. But that would be, to me, that's a game changer, not to leave the solar system. Again, to study the composition of how, and again, if it was captured, it's still, would it still be considered an exoplanet?
It would be considered a captured extra body, so
Okay.
It would still technically be an extra planet.
Yeah, and it would have all those markings of something either indigenous to that planet, or like I said earlier, an outpost.
Not to mention that its composition will be different from anything that you have here in the solar system, most likely. Basically, with different, going back into star formation itself, whenever you have a star die and go into supernova, it tends to make a planetary nebula or a planetary nova. The supernova shell tends to coalesce and form smaller stars. It's most likely what happened to our own sun. It was born, and as I was saying in the very first episode, through the process, and then the disk and all of that sort of stuff forms up. Now, for that, it could have been formed from a death of a different star, or it could have been from a star that met an untimely end. Either it got too close to a black hole and got sucked in and it got thrown out. In that case, it would be lucky. And we would also see the evidence. If it got close enough, we would see the rock and stuff actually be twisted in a very unusual way from extreme cases of gravity. But if it was formed in a larger, heavier type star, then it would have some heavier elements. But if it was formed from a pure natural nebula that wasn't influenced by other stars, just some gas floating around normally, star explodes, shockwave condenses it to go further, star process begins to get to the point where it gets enough mass, fusion is triggered, does the same process, planets form, rinse, rather, repeat. It just continues to happen. I mean, there's stars being born right now as we speak, even here in the Milky Way. Supernova aren't as common. There are supernova, novas, hypernova or hypernova, and then there would be theoretically a ultranova, which would be the death of a black hole. But each one of these type of nova, as it would go up, and I didn't put it in order. In order, it would be a nova, supernova, hypernova, and then an ultranova, which is the theoretical, death of a black hole. Each one of these would detonate and release material, and it would be heavier and heavier and heavier materials, which would give you more stuff to form planets and stars out of.
Yeah, speaking of a supernova, what is probably a candidate in our area of the galaxy of a supernova?
Betelgeuse is the closest one that comes to my mind in particular. It would be a decent-sized supernova. It's showing evidence that it might actually pop relatively soon. It's been dimming extremely radical. Of course, it could just be going through its own solar minimum. Red giants of that size would dim quite radically. We've seen it before, but Betelgeuse itself, and not going to go too crazy into it because that would be a whole episode onto its own, but
Right.
It seems to be dimming in such a ridiculous degree that it's very unusual. We haven't observed it amongst other stars. So it might be a star getting ready to explode viciously. And when it does, it'll be visible night and day. And through a process like that, it could throw out its planets. And going back to Planet 9, it could have been captured. And if it was one of that sort of a situation, you would see a lot more heavier elements be deposited onto the surface of the planet than what would be deeper inside of it, which would be an evidence that it survived the supernova explosion. It was cleansed. And if it's something really, really dense, a lot more dense than it should be, then it would be an evidence that it was a gas giant core. As I was saying in the episode of Jupiter, there's evidence and some hypothesis that Jupiter might have a heavy rocky core, which would be pretty dense. When a supernova happens, it would strip off the layers of the gas giant. All that'd be left is the core. The core goes flying out into space, gets captured by a different star, a star like ourselves, and that's basically it when it would come to that. Now, what would be really sad, and just imagine this, if Planet Nine had a civilization on it similar to our own when it got thrown out, and they survived, and they slowly died as the planet just kept getting colder and colder and colder. Because you would see it would be preserved very well. You would see more and more evidence as they would get more and more desperate, making underground bunkers, shells, different sort of things.
That's what I was ready to bring up. Could a species survive for some time?
Depends on how active the core is.
Yeah. Again, you would be out there just aimlessly going to your next destination, and say it would be captured by our sun. But what if, again, this is all speculation, theoretical. On the surface, you wouldn't find any indication that there was anything there. Could have survived for some time and eventually probably died out. But that would be a find, wouldn't it?
Oh, that would be a, just going back to what we were saying in the colonization episode of Mars, it'd be a paradigm shift because it would show that we are definitely not alone. We would, probably best place to look would be in the deeper sections of the planet's oceans if it had oceans, because ice can only go down so far. It would continue going down further and further and further, and eventually start, of course, evaporating as the atmosphere would eventually start evaporating itself. It's a complicated situation when a planet throws out, but if it was a really thick atmosphere planet like Venus, it would take it longer and longer to do so. It might even form oceans and go through the processes that form life, being how volcanic that it is. But you would want to go to the deeper sections of the ocean because they could gather around these these vents that are from the core itself, dig into the crust and make cities and survival situations there. If they have the ways of making artificial light, etc., they'd be quite fine. It just depends on the species. They might not even require light because we're talking eons. They would continue to travel. Enough time that their civilization and biologically themselves would evolve. Say they were a species like us that required our eyesight. They would most likely slowly start to lose their eyesight because out in the pitch black of space, you wouldn't really need it. Though the night sky, even though it would be getting cold for a little while, it would be beautiful because you would be able to see, especially if you were thrown out via like a planetary nebula and you weren't cooked by it, but just say
Right.
you weren't, you would see the exotic colors that the nebula itself would produce. Something that it would be better if we were in a planetary nebula than out in the empty space of our arms in the Milky Way, because yeah, we could see all these stars, see the sloths and all that, but if we were in a thicker nebula, we could see like the exotic colors and all of that. Just imagine that being like, Horsehead Nebula or something like that. The Pillars of Creation.
Well, here's the thing. With so many rogue planets out there, and again, this is speculation, but it's something that ponders thinking anyway. And again, not all of them would, but suppose some of those planets that were expelled from their system for whatever reason, whether their star went supernova or whatever, there could be entire civilizations that exist underground. And like you said, for eons, they would be traveling, going about their daily life. And essentially, a rogue planet with a civilization on it is just like one big giant ship or arc traveling aimlessly through the galaxy until it would come close to the gravitational pull of another sun and then become a mysterious planet X or whatever. Again, that would be a game changer, that some of these objects that we would come up on, and again, we're not going to run into that many, but there are an awful lot, when you're talking about the entire galaxy, probably an awful lot of rogue planets out there, right?
Oh, there's probably more rogue planets than there are actually planets orbiting stars themselves. Just rogue planets are the hardest ones to see, being that they would be pitch black, wouldn't be able to spot them until they actually started entering into planetary orbits of whatever it happened to be orbiting.
Right.
Now, the thing is, the civilization, say if they were on Planet X and stuff like that, if there was some that would be out there, it would be close enough that they would start to notice that, hey, they are back within. That's how come I heavily doubt that there would be a civilization. If we did find it, it would be long dead. It would be a type of situation, maybe it was traveling long time, and the planet itself started to cool significantly. Without the help of a star, it's hard to keep its core going. It'll start losing momentum. So the core and the planet's activity slowly dies. And when they are faced with the fact and they fully realize that their civilization is dead, it's just a matter of time, they would probably, unless they wanted to be forgotten about, which I don't think any society truly wants to be forgotten about, do something to put down their history, put down their things, and maybe, in a last ditch effort, one last chance of survival, put down their DNA code, maybe even freeze some of their own bodies, use their own technology, whatever they would happen to have. Say they had fusion technology or even primitive reactors would be able to do it, something that would power something for a few years and enough to automated systems keep it automated, have some of their own bodies on, cryo, just so if any civilization finds them and they look at it like, oh, here's their biological code, here's their history, we can't really read it, but there might be enough stuff for us to decipher it. We can learn whole bunch of stuff about them and maybe bring them back to life. It's hard to tell when it comes to the future.
Right. Here's the thing. A civilization that would go to, like you said, they're facing their own mortality now. They don't have much time left. So they decide to make some kind of a record to preserve their existence. Okay. Where would you put that? Would you on purpose keep it inside the planet, or would you put some kind of a marker or a beacon or something on the surface? Because you want this to be found. You don't try to preserve all the good stuff that you have achieved for millennia and leave it buried inside the planet. That's kind of self-defeating. It's because, like you said, it's an object that is very dark. The space in between the stars is vast. So you got to put it out there to where hopefully it's like somebody taking a message in a bottle and throwing it in the ocean with the hopes it's going to wash up on shore and somebody's going to be there at that exact moment and pick it up and take the note out and read it, right?
Yeah, basically. It really depends on the condition of the planet. Say, whatever pushed them out didn't really damage the planet itself that much on the surface, so they have the remnants of their old cities and societies. Say the last major construction project that they're going to do before they slip into that cold night once and for all, they come out to the surface and they decide to build a tower, one that would be visibly newer than everything else and the old ruins of their former civilization at its height. Just imagine Earth, old skyscrapers toppled over, a whole bunch of different stuff like that, remnants of plants and animals, a whole bunch of different things just frozen in time, frozen over by ice. You would have all that old, and then you would have this noticeably newer tower. Have it that, going back to what I was saying, even if they had some primitive fusion technology or some very primitive, have automated system, have it run on really base power, and if it does come into contact with another star, have it slowly turn on its systems and just start broadcasting. Because any other intelligent species, heck, what do we listen to when we look for aliens and stuff like that? We are listening for radio signals.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be saying, oh, come here, come here. All it has to do is just blast out heavy radio waves in all directions, all frequencies. That'll be enough to get the attention, and then you come and you find that radio tower and then follow it down to its source, and you find, their tomb, their last, attempt
Their
for
last stand.
possible survival. Yep. Their last desperate act, and you find and learn the story of this civilization, whatever it happened to be. And Planet 9, there's a small possibility, heavily doubt that it would be, but we could find remnants of a civilization on it, which would be interesting, as I was saying before. And if it was a society that was more advanced, there's a chance that we could take some of their technology and advance our own society, even if, unfortunately, they themselves were doomed once and for all and forever. Now, also, if they were able to take a heavy-duty record of whatever basically killed their star or whatever happened, say their star went supernova, they had a pretty big one, and they categorized and recorded meticulously the process of how their red giant and then how the red giant eventually died. That would be incredibly valuable for us, because our sun is eventually going to turn into a red giant itself. And if they had a detailed record of, like, here's the signs, this is what happened as it generally got hotter and hotter and hotter, because we're only doing basic guesswork when it comes to basically how our sun's going to go through that process until we can actually observe it itself. If we had this data, it would tell us that, hey, this is the different things. Maybe they moved out further and further, or they were lucky enough in their star didn't eat their planet and pushed it out through the solar winds. I mean, some solar winds could be powerful enough to push a planet away. It just depends on how powerful the sun's going to be. Like I said, ours is pretty quiet right now, but there could be a time frame where it blew stuff out. It might be able to do it again. Now, Planet 9 also could have another interesting thing about it. Say if it was a true water world where there was no landmass, and when we find it, it'll be nothing but a giant ice ball. Because if it was an actual water world, like we like to call our planet a water world, it is not truly a water world. True water world would have no land. It would just be nothing but water. I mean, yeah, underneath the crust and all that, there would be that, but there would just be nothing constantly. You get down to a certain point, and being that it's around the sun, the core will still have enough to keep it going, maybe slightly. But as I was saying with the other one, they go down to the bottom sections of the ocean. With the planetary soup that would be going on, you could have life form underneath that ice around those vents, keeping it warm at that layer where it's warm enough that it didn't melt. And that would be interesting in and of itself to go down and find that, put a submarine through it. It's basically what they want to do with one of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. They believe that there's a giant amount of oceans under Io.
Right.
With Planet 9. And like I said, if it is exotic, and then you can look at its water compensation, you find out that, oh, look at all that water. Oh, it's slightly different. Say there's another element that's in it that's not in Earth, water, but it's still got enough that it's basically water. Say there's a type of mineral that's not found in Earth water that's in theirs. That would be another sign that, hey, this doesn't come from our solar system. It comes from another solar system. So there's hundreds of things that could possibly happen to it. Or going back a little bit, going back to the formation of the solar system, there is a theory that the large gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn, actually migrated out. Planet 9 might have actually been, say, a super Earth that was in the inner solar system and then got flung out when they were migrating outwards. And if that was the case of how it happened, it would explain why it had such a strange orbit, but it would be invaluable to go and look at it and then to mine down into it, because it would be a picture of our solar system in its infancy, because it wouldn't have had enough time to be basically continued to be bombarded even more. So you would see the very early phases of the solar system. And it would have gotten a lot more of the lighter material out there. So it would be incredible to learn more from that planet if it exists.
Okay, one thing that just got my attention, my mind working here a bit, listening the different ways there could be a planet X. All the planets in our solar system, except for demoted Pluto. When did this first come about that there could possibly be another planet, a Planet 9?
Well, originally, they started looking for Planet 9 and they accidentally found Pluto and thought that that would be the planet. So that's clear back in the very early 1900s. They suspected that there would be another planet. Now, the serious look for Planet 9 started in 2014 when they were basically going back to the chart that I mentioned earlier that should have been on the screen, and if it can be put back on the screen now. All of that orbital data was being analyzed, and as more and more came in, they started, that looks really weird. They are going in that one general area, as that is the point where they were originally flung out. And that would heavily suggest, if you all look onto a smaller graph yourselves of like the asteroid belt, or take a look at objects in Earth's orbit, you would see that as the planet moves, it flings things into these weird elliptical orbits as it clears its path. And then eventually they get to such extreme orbits that their final interaction flings them out completely. And that's basically what's happening there. There is such an extreme, it suggests that there has to be something roughly on that plane. Now, if it was a more conventional orbit to the rest of the solar system, we would have probably found it by now, which suggests that it is most likely on the extreme elliptical orbit that we were mentioning before, which, in my opinion, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is, but I am in the thermal camp that it suggests that it's a captured object itself, which then influenced the Kuiper Belt objects. And to also go and throw out, no, the way that they all converge means that Neptune and Uranus could not interfere. It's too far out. It's past Pluto's orbit. So both of the ice giants do not have influence in that area anymore. And if it does, it's extremely minute. Now, there's also, as I mentioned before, very small evidence, they're still gathering right now, that even further out, there could be a 10th planet, basically Planet XX. And if we add another one, we might have to Might have to blur it
Planet
out.
Triple X.
But for Planet 10, basically the same thing. It's just further out. Now,
Okay, here's the thing. If you got a Planet 9, a Planet 10, maybe possibly a Planet 11, where does the solar system end? Or does it? Do we just sit around and wait till another rogue planet shows up? You know, there's our star captures something else. Is there truly an end, or is it still in a stage of relative calm? Our solar system right now compared to its birth, but is it still evolving?
oh, of course, it's still evolving. As I was saying before, it's eventually going to turn into a red giant. And it might be the stage where our sun is basically in its middle, just nice, calm, being mellow. It doesn't have to worry about other things. And then it might have a midlife crisis where it wants to go out and buy a Ferrari, and it will flare up and become more active again as it burns heavy elements. And then eventually it will condense, and the core will get a lot more hotter and get further down, and the outer layers will expand even further as it becomes the red giant, which will eventually possibly consume Earth. It'll get to the point where Earth itself will be heavily burnt to the point where life barely, if at all, would be sustainable anymore.
Or we're actually residing inside of the sun?
Oh yeah, in the outer layers. Now, for a red giant, it's not the same as being in the sun right now. Like if we were in the outermost layer of the sun, planet would dissolve. The planet would basically, in the outer layers of the red giant, it would still be there. It'd be scorched. We would see the evidence of it when the nova happened, and it blows out the our sun. Even whenever it goes to red giant, it won't be a big enough red giant, so it'll just go nova, where it'll basically blast out its lower layer. Basically, kind of like the Crab Eye Nebula. If you can pop up an image of the Crab Eye Nebula, it just loses its outer layers, and they just slowly go out. That's a planetary nova,
Right?
Or a binary system where the other one smacks into the other star. Now that's a devastating, but that's a planetary nova as well. But it could also go to supernova, just depends on the size of it. Our star, as I've already said, just not big enough to do that. Now, for our sun, as it evolves and continues to go a little bit more and more and more, if there is if Planet 9 does actually exist, which the evidence is pretty strong in its favor right now. Planet 10, a little iffy. There could even be a Planet 11 if it continues out that way, as we find more and more objects that are the trans objects beyond the Keiber, the trans-Keiberan objects. There might even be another belt out there. It's just hard to observe since the sun and its light won't be able to reflect very good to that point, and it would be pretty minute. Now, the sun's influence, it does end. It ends roughly about, I think, 1,000. Basically, about a light year is whenever you get completely out of the sun's influence. The solar winds are already gone whenever you're basically, both Voyagers are out of the solar wind areas and are out of the extreme gravity effects and has escaped the main influence of the sun, but they are still within the slight gravitational influence, and you'll have that completely out to a light year.
Okay, by a slight gravitational influence, does that mean that technically they are still part of the solar system?
It would be yes and no, because after you get past the solar winds, the gravitational effects of the sun are almost non-existent. It's just enough to the point that you're able to find it.
So in other words, they are truly in interstellar space then?
Yeah, they're truly in interstellar space. They could basically navigate to find dark stars, some like really dim red dwarfs. Theirs would be like somewhere around like 500 AU, like half of what the sun's influence would be, maybe even less. And that would be a good way to navigate to find them. It's just you find the minute gravitational effects of it, and then you move in closer and closer and closer. It's also the best way to find a black hole. You find the first minute gravitational effects. And for a black hole, it would be different because it would, instead of increasing gradually, it would increase magnitudes more. And it would basically be enough to tell you, hey, don't go here.
Right.
You're going in a very bad area. Go the opposite direction. But that's basically all I have to say, though, when it comes to Planet 9 and Planet 10, Kevin, if there's anything else you want to ask.
If this happens to our solar system, the whole idea of a solar system anywhere in the galaxy or the universe, no matter what galaxy you're in, the story is not completely written on that solar system. And what I mean by that, under most cases, you're going to have a binary, trinary star system. Again, ours is kind of like the odd out with only the one sun. But it seems if there are as many rogue planets that we think is possibly out there, and somehow they come too close to a star and become a captured object around that star, then all solar systems, even the ones that are not having what they had in the early formation of that solar system, it's still growing, right?
Oh yeah, they will hoof up and capture things as they move through space. They'll steal planets from other star systems as they get close to one another. It just really depends on how it is. Say if the Earth got flung out and the moon stayed with us completely through, I mean that would be a good essential thing for survival if the moon stayed with us, because then the core would maintain its activity a lot longer. If it got captured, say, by Alpha Centauri, then we would become part of the story of Alpha Centauri, and if Earth managed to maintain enough of its biomass and maintain life, it would just be another episode of basically life on Earth.
Right. And on that, really enjoyed the conversation. We made it all the way out to Planet X. And again, really enjoyed these conversations, William. Again, I learned something new every time we have a conversation, and that's the whole point of doing these. And hopefully, the listener out there can learn something, because that's why we do this. And I want to thank you once again, William, and take care. We'll see you.
Oh yeah, we'll be back. That was the end of our first series, and a little bit of spoilers. We got another one coming, hopefully relatively soon. Talk to you later, Kevin.
Yes, thank you for the conversation, William. And as William said, that is the end of Series 1. This was the exploration of the solar system. And that's about all for this episode. And guess what? I'm out of here.